Welcome to episode 125 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we complete Epicurus's letter to Herodotus. Next week we'll turn to the letter to Pythocles, but for today let's complete Herodotus by listening to Martin read the concluding section of the text.
Furthermore, we must believe that to discover accurately the cause of the most essential facts is a function of the science of nature, and that blessedness for us in the knowledge of celestial phenomena lies in this and in the understanding of the nature of the existences seen in these celestial phenomena, and of all else that is akin to the exact knowledge requisite for our happiness. In knowing too that what occurs in several ways or is capable of being otherwise has no place here, but that nothing which suggests doubt or alarm can be included at all in that which is naturally immortal and blessed. Now this we can ascertain by our mind is absolutely the case. But what falls within the investigation of risings and settings and turnings and eclipses, and all that is akin to this, is no longer of any value for the happiness which knowledge brings. But persons who have perceived all this, but yet do not know what are the natures of these things and what are the essential causes, are still in fear, just as if they did not know these things at all. Indeed, their fear may be even greater, since the wonder which arises out of the observation of these things cannot discover any solution or realize the regulation of their essentials. And for this very reason, even if we discover several causes for turnings and settings and risings and eclipses and the like, as has been the case already in our investigation of detail, we must not suppose that our inquiry into these things has not reached sufficient accuracy to contribute to our peace of mind and happiness. So we must carefully consider in how many ways a similar phenomenon is produced on earth when the reason about the causes of celestial phenomena and all that is imperceptible to the senses. And we must despise those persons who do not recognize either what exists or comes into being in one way only, or that which may occur in several ways in the case of things which can only be seen by us from a distance, and further are not aware under what conditions it is impossible to have peace of mind. If, therefore, we think that a phenomenon probably occurs in some such particular way, and that in circumstances under which it is equally possible for us to be at peace, when we realize that it may occur in several ways, we shall be just as little disturbed as if we know that it occurs in some particular way. And besides all these matters in general, we must grasp this point, that the principal disturbance in the minds of men arises because they think that these celestial bodies are blessed and immortal, and yet have wills and actions and motives inconsistent with these attributes, and because they are always expecting or imagining some everlasting misery, such as is depicted in legends, or even fear the loss of feeling in death as though it would concern them themselves, and again, because they are brought to this pass not by reasoned opinion, but rather by some irrational presentiment. And therefore, as they do not know the limits of pain, they suffer a disturbance equally great or even more extensive than if they had reached this belief by opinion. But peace of mind is being delivered from all this, and having a constant memory of the general and most essential principles. Wherefore we must pay attention to internal feelings and to external sensations in general and in particular, according as the subject is general or particular, and to every immediate intuition in accordance with each of the standards of judgment. For if we pay attention to these, we all rightly trace the causes whence arose our mental disturbance and fear, and by learning the true causes of celestial phenomena and all other occurrences that come to pass from time to time, we shall free ourselves from all which produces the utmost fear in other men. Here, Herodotus, is my treatise on the chief points concerning the nature of the general principle, abridged so that my account would be easy to grasp with accuracy. I think that even if one were unable to proceed to all the detailed particulars of the system, he would from this obtain an unrivaled strength compared with other men. For indeed, he will clear up for himself many of the detailed points by reference to our general system, and those very principles, if he stores them in his mind, will constantly aid him. For such is their character that even those who are at present engaged in working out the details to a considerable degree, or even completely, will be able to carry out the greater part of the investigations into the nature of the whole by conducting the analysis in reference to such a survey of this. And as for all who are not fully among those on the way to being perfected, some of them can from this summary obtain a hasty view of the most important matters without our instructions so as to secure peace of mind.
Okay, Martin, thank you for reading that for us today. We have now read to the very end of the letter to Herodotus. And as I listen to you read it, I see that there are a lot of sort of general and summary statements about everything that we've been talking about before and how to apply it, what it means, the significance of it. And so as we wrap up the letter, I don't know whether we'll finish everything today or not. It kind of depends on how closely we choose to look at each line, because even though it's a sort of a summary, there's a lot here, but we're not introducing any new scientific observations today. We're really going back over the general way to look at things. And I had forgotten this as well as we started this morning, that this is one of those places where Epicurus introduces the idea of multiple causes being sufficient for our peace of mind and happiness. And that's one of the very interesting things about Epicurus's approach, is that he emphasized how we may not know the exact cause of something, but if we can determine a number of reasonable causes that are consistent with the evidence, that really provides us the peace of mind that we really are looking for, so that we don't have to entertain the possibility that there's some mysterious evil influence ready to smash us at any moment. So anyway, let's go back into 78. The first passage here introduces this idea and emphasizes that even if we think that those things that are occurring happens maybe in several ways, we don't include at all anything that would cause doubt or alarm in our analysis as part of divinity, because what's naturally immortal and blessed just doesn't have anything to do with arbitrariness and punishment and reward of friends or punishment of enemies. In the last sentence, now this we can ascertain by our mind is absolutely the case. Okay, who'd like to start with that?
So as we've been reading through this letter, I keep going back to that sentence in the very beginning of the letter to Herodotus. We're now coming to the end. And what he said in the beginning was that it was the study of nature that was the chief source of joy, one of the chief sources of joy in his life. And so now we have more or less, I think, the same claim restated. In fact, here he says what we're looking for particularly is exact knowledge requisite for our happiness. So that's an interesting claim, because when you read some of these other ancient sources, they seem to have believed that Epicurus was kind of not very bright and incurious, and he just didn't want to bother knowing things or pursuing things. And yet here we have him say that not only is that not the case, but that knowing that exact knowledge of the phenomenon of nature is requisite for human happiness. And so that seems to me to be the main thrust of this whole letter that we've been reading. And I think absolutely crucial to that is this understanding that nature, if it can be understood according to, I guess, natural laws, is not subject to divine intervention and the caprices, that's the word, and the caprices of the Greek gods. And the don't remember where this comes from Virgil in a reference to Lucretius, to the din of the devouring underworld. That's the problem. And we know it's the problem, and I'm jumping all the way to the very end of the letter here. But at the very end, Epicurus says, some of them can, from this summary, obtain a hasty view of the most important matters without oral instruction. I found those three words to be very, very suggestive, because it seems to me that what's happening here, and the reason Epicurus is writing these letters, people are coming to him. He's set up shop. People are coming to him with questions, with problems in their lives that they want solved. And one of the big problems is, how can I live with peace of mind, knowing that there's so much going on? I've got the oracles who are telling me that bad things are going to happen in exchange for money, of course. I've got the priests and the prophets of different religions, and they're all more or less on this doom and gloom screed. And how do I know what's really true? And how is that going to secure for me the kind of peace of mind and happiness and the life of pleasure that I really want to pursue? So people are coming to him to ask him questions. That to me is very suggestive. We don't very often get in these letters a kind of insight into how things might have worked in the garden, but this seems to me to be one of the moments when sort of the veil is pulled back slightly. You can see far back into time and see what was happening. And I think I've rattled on for long enough, but I do find that to be very, very interesting.
Yeah, let me pick up with that on that very last sentence. And as for all who are not fully among those on the way to being perfected, as I read that, it seems like he's addressing that as if you're isolated out somewhere. You're not living among other Epicurean friends who can talk with you about these things on a regular basis. So as for those who aren't fully among those on the way to being perfected, some of them can, from the summary, obtain a hasty view of the most important matters without oral instruction. And yeah, I think that's really important, almost also from the negative point of view, that it implies that oral instruction and oral communication back and forth is very helpful and probably was a huge part of what they were doing. It's not like they were just going to write letters and commit their thoughts to writing. They were actually seeing the need to be discussing these things, working among each other, people who are like-minded, kind of like we're doing today in the podcast or on the forum that we have, things like that. You're not going to get the best benefit out of this unless you can talk with other people, compare your thoughts with those of others, and learn from other people who have maybe made more progress in understanding the philosophy than others have. Let me use that to go back to the 78 again, because I think there's probably a lot of criticism of Epicurus, and I think you were talking about it, Joshua, that people can look at Epicurus and say he's not particularly interested in education, or he's not a smart guy, or things like that. And one way of accusing him of that would be to say that he just made up his mind that he wanted to have a good time, and he didn't care about anything else other than having a good time. So everything had to be judged by that, and even the study of nature was just something that he made subordinate to his arbitrary decision to just have a good time. And I would oppose that argument by saying that I don't think Epicurus started out with the idea of simply having a good time as his absolute goal. What we have from when he was a child was that he was concerned about the explanation of where the universe came from and whether it was chaos and where chaos would have come from and things like that. I think the right approach to Epicurus is that the study of nature leads you to the conclusion that nature has given us only pleasure and pain as our ultimate goals. And so the starting point is not to just simply decide you're going to be happy as an arbitrary conclusion. The starting point is to look at nature and decide that it's nature that's told you that the goal of life is to be happy. And to me, that's a huge distinction, because there's so many people who are out there who just seem to me to take an arbitrary position. They just pick some goal and they're just going to go with that goal, and whether that goal is legitimate for anybody else doesn't seem to be of any concern to them. But Epicurus doesn't really start with an arbitrary goal. He starts with, I think, the study of nature, which leads you to a justification for why the goal of happiness is the right one. So I see that in 78, that you're not just making everything subservient to your chosen direction in life. You are looking at life and deciding from that what your chosen direction should be. And that last line of that first sentence, now this we can ascertain by our mind, is absolutely the case. I would say that that's sort of a statement that you can look at the universe and observe things. This goes back into that Francis Wright discussion again. You can observe things all you want, but at some point you've got to take your observations and reach some conclusions. And he seems to be very firm We've had some discussions recently on our A Few Days in Athens podcast, and the Epicureans and Epicurus, they didn't really go off in different directions after Epicurus because they had the sense that Epicurus got it right, that Epicurus had identified from nature that living happily is in fact the goal. And once you get that right, there's really no need to agonize over and over and over about other potential directions in life when you've reached the conclusion that nature has pointed a particular one. So that's ranting 2. Martin, it's your turn to rant. What would you like to rant about?
I pretty much agree with what you both said, so I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay.
Well, I started to quote Virgil, and let me get the whole quote on the record here. And this comes from the Eclogues, I think. I'm not entirely sure. But Virgil says, "Happy is he who has discovered the causes of things and has cast beneath his feet all fears, unavoidable fate, and the din of the devouring underworld." So we know that Virgil read Lucretius because there's a number of allusions to lines in Lucretius in Virgil's work. But this, to me, is a sort of encapsulation of everything that Lucretius was trying to do in his long and somewhat difficult poem, over 7,000 lines, on nature and how it works and what we can learn from that and profit from that. And I don't mean profit as in money. I mean profit as in pleasure and human happiness and the removal of fear and concerns about fate. And so this line from Virgil, I think, sums up the project of Lucretius, what he was trying to do. And in some sense, it's also the project of this letter to Herodotus and what Epicurus was trying to do.
And maybe one more twist I would put on, I think what you just said and what we were talking about is that, again, it's not like Epicurus is arbitrarily telling us to pursue pleasure and avoid pain at all times, because he's made very clear in other letters, I think potentially even earlier in this one, but certainly in the letter to Menorchus and other places, that you don't always pursue at the moment what is pleasurable or always at the moment avoid what is painful. You sometimes choose pain in order to achieve a greater pleasure as a result of that choice. So he's not just somebody, I've been reading some material that causes me to be worked up about this particular issue. It's not that Epicurus is so sensitive or hypersensitive to pain, that he's avoiding pain. He's not obsessed with avoiding pain. He's not obsessed necessarily even with pursuing pleasure. I think he pursues pleasure because he's rationally come to the conclusion, ascertained it through his mind and through deep analysis of all these issues, that pursuing happiness, pursuing pleasure is what nature intends. But you don't know that for sure and with confidence unless you go through this reasoning process. Okay. 79, and this 79 and 80, I think there's an analog in Lucretius, which unfortunately I don't have in front of me this morning. Maybe I can find it and put it in the show notes. But he starts talking about what falls within the investigations of eclipses and the things that are akin to that. Persons who have perceived all this, but yet do not know what are the natures of these things and what are the essential causes, are still in fear. In other words, you can study eclipses and maybe even get to the point where you predict them and are able to tell what time and how long they may last, things like that. But if you don't know the nature of what it is you're talking about and the essential causes of the eclipse, you can still be in fear, just as if you'd never studied those things in the first place. And indeed, quote, indeed, their fear may even be greater, since the wonder which arises out of the observation of these things cannot discover any solution or realize the regulation of the essentials. So to some extent, this is also directed at this issue that Francis Wright's concerned about. You can observe eclipses, you can study the stars, you can get telescopes and get all sorts of observations about them. But unless you come to some conclusions about their nature, you still have not eliminated the possibility that they're gods who are about to punish you and send you to eternal hell. Joshua.
I think it goes even one point further here. He seems to be saying that, because I'm not sure as I read this, but what falls within the investigation of risings and settings and turnings and eclipses and all that is akin to this is no longer of any value for the happiness which knowledge brings. So he seems to be saying once you've gotten to the point where you've come up with a series of natural explanations, it's not necessarily possible at the time that he's writing to prove which one is wrong. But he seems to think once you've gotten that far and you've gotten to the point where, okay, I've got a series of natural explanations. Now I can rule out. It's quite reasonable at this point to rule out any supernatural explanation. And Epicurus seems to be saying here that at that point, you should be beyond experiencing any fear or doubt or concern stemming from what's going on in the heavens. And seems to me that he's writing this because there were people who weren't. They wanted what Epicurus was probably not capable of giving them, which is they wanted the absolute correct answer on everything. And that's not really how scientific inquiry works, because you're never going to know all of the answer. What you need, and what most of us need, is to get to a point where we have enough knowledge about enough of the causes that explain the effects that are the phenomena that we observe in nature to have settled the position that, okay, we don't think that the gods or anything supernatural is involved here. We're pretty sure that even though we may not know the answer is going to have a perfectly reasonable, natural explanation. And therefore, we don't have to spend our whole lives trying to figure out this one problem. There's a lot of areas that we can look to expand our knowledge base and to refine our conclusions. So it's not necessarily the case that we have to spend our whole lives in trying to figure out why the sun rises in the east. And if I can't figure out why the sun rises in the east, well, then I guess I'm just going to live my whole life in petrifying fear of, once again, the din of the devouring underworld.
In my mind, there's some analogy here too with, like, for example, astrologers. I always have this impression that the Babylonians have this advanced knowledge of astrology and the way that the stars and the planets would move and so forth. To me, that's potentially also part of what he's saying here, is that you can become the most precise astrologer in the world in terms of being able to predict where particular stars are in the sky at a particular moment and all sorts of things like that. But that unless you've gotten to the point of understanding that there are natural causes for what you're talking about, all of your astrological science knowledge is going to leave you in the same kind of fear or even greater fear, since you've not taken that knowledge and carried it into an understanding of, like what Josh was talking about, that there are many reasonable causes in what we're observing in the sky that don't involve those stars being supernatural.
And what a perfect time for us to be having this conversation, because what's going on right now, and I don't, maybe Martin is aware of what's going on in the sky, but you've got, for basically the whole month of June, all 5 of the visible planets are in alignment along the ecliptic in their proper order from the sun. So this is exactly the kind of thing that these, and you're absolutely right, these Babylonian astrologers or even astronomers who were very advanced in the study of the movement of the celestial bodies, this is exactly the kind of thing that would have put them out of joint and given them pause about what was going on, because it's the kind of thing that in a world, where chance governs, it's the kind of thing that you do expect to happen. Eventually this is going to happen, and even more so in a universe or a solar system that functions in a way almost like clockwork, although a clock without a clockmaker. So I think you're making an excellent point there.
Martin, before we go on to 80, I think 80 is going to be an even more explicit statement of this issue of alternative causes being satisfactory for us. But any thoughts so far? Okay, well, going on then into 80, this is going to be the heart of the multiple cause position. And this is something I think I see ridiculed at times as well. Some people seem to imply that Epicurus will say that sometimes multiple things that are contradictory, we should accept them as being true. I'll have to look back and see if I can find a good caricature of what I'm talking about. But the heart of what he's saying seems to be that we must not suppose that our inquiry into these things has not reached sufficient accuracy to contribute to our peace of mind and happiness, even if we discover several causes for turnings and settings and rises and eclipses. He says we must carefully consider how in many ways a similar phenomenon is produced on Earth when we reason about things going on in the sky and that are imperceptible to the senses. And then he goes even further and says something that I've always found interesting. We must despise those persons who do not recognize either what exists or comes into being in one way only, or that which may occur in several ways. And further on, they're not aware under what conditions it's impossible to have peace of mind. In other words, it seems to me that he's saying that those people who will arbitrarily choose one possibility and latch onto it, even though there's evidence that supports several possibilities, that in itself is a major, major problem. That if there is evidence to support multiple possibilities, to jump to the conclusion or to just arbitrarily pick one of them and assert that that's the only one that's possible is just a very fallacious and dangerous reasoning. And therefore, the last sentence of 80 is that if we think that a phenomena probably occurs in some particular way, but in circumstances under which it is equally possible for us to be at peace, when we realize it can occur in several ways, we should be just as little disturbed as if we know it occurs in some particular way. In other words, I guess he's saying there, if you can't eliminate it down to fewer than 3 or 4 possibilities, you still should be in your mind okay with the 3 or 4 that are reasonable, as long as those 3 or 4 don't include that there's some monster who's about to destroy you as one of those possibilities. As long as you've got alternate natural possibilities that you don't have enough information to choose between, you're still okay in terms of your peace of mind and your confidence in living your life in a way that makes sense. Joshua, what do you see about 80? And I know that is in Lucretius as well. I've got to find the reference to that. Very similar. He even calls people who do something like that almost like witch doctors or something similar to that. I think that's in Lucretius, or it may actually be in the letter to Epicurus as well. But anyway, go ahead, Joshua.
Well, I don't have much to say to that. It seems to be, I think that this word despise is going to ruffle some feathers. And it's not, I guess, entirely clear to me what we are or who we are despising. I get the general idea here that you've got a phenomenon in nature. You have what you presume to be an effect, but you don't know the cause. You can reason based on the available evidence toward a number of possible causes, and you can maybe even whittle it down to what you think are some probable causes, but without sufficient evidence to just assert that one of these or a specific one of these things is true, that in some way that even causes more problems than just not knowing. I guess I find the idea somewhat difficult.
Yeah. See, I relate this in my mind as well back into the principal doctrines, especially to 23, 24, and 25. And the way you phrased it a moment ago, Joshua, in terms of who it is that we despise, I mean, maybe Bailey's translation here needs to be looked at more carefully, but go ahead.
Down to the Hicks translation, and it says that these people should be held in contempt.
Held in. So what I get out of that, and I've certainly, this is just my opinion, but what I'm thinking that he's emphasizing is that this is just a very, very, very critical issue for everybody to understand. And we should really banish from our own thoughts possibilities of thinking in a different way. Because when you go back to the principal doctrines on 24 especially, 24 is the one about if you reject any single sensation and fail to distinguish between the conclusion of the opinion as to the appearance waiting confirmation and that which is actually given, you'll confound all your sensations as well with the same groundless opinions, and you'll reject every standard of judgment. In other words, if you look at 24, then 25 says, if on any occasion, instead of referring your actions to the end of the nature, you turn to some other nearer standard when you're making a choice or avoidance, your actions will not be consistent with your principles. I just have always seen this as just an emphatic statement that it's not okay for you to accept the idea that, well, anything's possible, and so I'm not going to reach a conclusion about it. It's like, to me, he's telling you it is really, really important for you to look at the evidence in front of you and separate out the possibilities into rational categories. If a number of possibilities are equally supported by the evidence, then you don't just arbitrarily pick one and say all the others are wrong. This is that issue in Diogenes Laertius. Joshua, I think we should probably refer back to that about the weighting. That's included in Diogenes Laertius, that when you have multiple possibilities, you don't simply choose one which is your favorite. You wait until you have more evidence to choose between the two. Because if you do choose something based on a criteria other than the evidence, then you're really opening the trapdoor underneath you to believe anything. If you can look at something and say that, well, I don't have the evidence to believe these supernatural God theories, but I'm going to accept it as possible anyway, then that's not just a harmless mistake. That's just disastrous to the Epicurean way of processing information. You're just not going to possibly be able to find the kind of peace of mind that you would have otherwise if you stick to the evidence and stick to rational decision making for your conclusions. And even though that may seem abstract or difficult, I'm thinking he's just saying that you really have to hold on to that firmly and hold in contempt an argument that unfounded possibilities are equally possible with those that have a lot of evidence to support them. That would be the direction I think he's going there. And I kind of agree with that as a huge issue. Let's try again. Martin, what are you thinking there? The issue here is, how do you treat the assertion of possibilities without any evidence to support them? Is it just something you can harmlessly look at and say, well, that's possible, I don't know? Or do you need to be more aggressive than that?
That depends on the circumstances. By the celestial phenomena, we don't need to worry at all. So it doesn't matter if we figure out the detailed mechanism, just as long as we keep being convinced that there is a natural mechanism which keeps those celestial bodies on the move or the other phenomena going.
But I guess what we have in life is that people are going to walk up to us, or maybe in 300 BC, they walked up to people in Athens and they said, I suggest to you, I tell you the sun is a god, and the sun has created the world, and it is necessary for you to worship the sun in order to be happy. So what are you going to do with somebody like that? Are you just going to say, well, that's possible? Or are you going to hold them in contempt and despise them for not having an evidentiary reason to support their assertion? Do you separate yourself from people like that? Or like you said, Martin, too, it depends on the context. But when somebody is walking up to you and saying to you that in Athens, we worship the sun on Sundays, and if you don't, you're going to be killed. What do we do with that?
You flee to
walk away, or
I'm sorry, which of the two of you, Martin?
Walk away or pull the sword and defend.
And Joshua, what did you say?
I said you flee to Lampsacus. Is what Epicurus did and what Anaxagoras did.
Well, it seems clear to me that it's like Martin has said, it's a context that's important here. And depending on the circumstances, if you're able to basically safely ignore such things, then you can safely ignore them and just mentally make a note that you don't want any part of that yourself. But many circumstances don't lend themselves to just walking away. And when you're young, you go to school, you go to college, you're confronted with so many different types of assertions about what you must believe. And this is one of those situations that, to me, betrays how ridiculous it is to assert that Epicurus was a cultist or was just trying to force everybody to believe the same way he did. I mean, he's emphasizing that you hold in contempt people who assert that you should believe something that seems to you to be contrary to the evidence. You just don't take things on faith and on trust when there's not evidence to support it.
If I understand what's being said here, then what Epicurus is really doing is staking out a position between credulity on the religious side and hardline incredulity on the skeptic side. That it is possible to know certain things, that some causes in nature really can be found out, but that in lieu of good reason or good evidence to believe in a certain cause, or to believe that a certain cause is the explanation for the effect that we see, that's a problem going too far in the other direction. So
I think what you said is 100% correct, Joshua. And I just think the only problem I have with the way you said it is that it could be said maybe more firmly than that and more aggressively than that. But yeah, I think the way you've just described it is exactly right. He's staking out a position between, not necessarily between them, he's staking out a third position. He's stating that gross credulity, faith, is one position, that radical skepticism, that nothing is provable, is a second position. And it's not necessarily between those two. He's saying both of them are wrong. He's saying some things you can know and some things you can't. And you shouldn't accept either the credulity of faith-based reasoning, nor should you reject all conclusions at all that comes from being a radical skeptic. And he was apparently confronted with both those alternatives in the form of Pyrrho before him, and of course the religious people as well. So it's not like this is new for us. He would have been facing the very same thing.
Fair enough. So that does 80, I think. 81. And besides all these matters in general, we must grasp this point that the principal disturbance in the minds of men arises because they think that these celestial bodies are blessed and immortal. This is more of just what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
That when it comes to, in a fanciful translation of Lucretius, the gliding signs of heaven, that knowing how they work, it's important to try to know how they work. Probably not going to be really possible in the 3rd century BC to really grasp why and how they work and what drives them. There's no theory of gravity when Epicurus is writing, or for about 2,000 years after Epicurus is writing, almost exactly 2,000 years. So it would be ludicrous, I think, to imagine that it was possible in that time to really know everything there was to know about what's going on in the sky. And the important thing, though, is that there's one answer in particular, and that is to attribute to the celestial bodies attributes such as blessedness and immortality, coupled with capriciousness and immorality that you get from the Greek gods. That's the one thing, that's the one conclusion he really hopes you won't reach. And that seems to be what he's saying here in 81, yeah.
I think you're exactly right. You focused most of what you were talking about there on the first part of 81. And it's interesting to me that he combines it probably with the Principal Doctrine 1 and Principal Doctrine 2, because the second part, because they're always expecting or imagining some everlasting misery, such as depicted in legends, or even fear the loss of feeling in death, as though it would concern themselves. So he's referencing here in 81 not only just the idea that the celestial bodies are supernatural, but also the issue of death, that we should not concern ourselves with the idea that death would bring everlasting misery or any kind of pain to us. And then the last part of that is, again, I think focused on this issue of the need for reasoned understanding to defeat that, because they are brought to this pass not by reasoned opinion, but by some irrational presentiment. And therefore, because they don't know the limits of pain, they suffer a disturbance as great or greater than if they had reached this belief by opinion. Now, that last part about reaching it by opinion doesn't seem to be very clear to me. But this is very similar to what Lucretius is talking about in Book 1 about the threats of the priests and how it's impossible for us to defeat the oppression of religion and the threats of the priests if we do not understand the nature of life and how that there is a limit to pain and an absolute limit to what happens to us after death, that there's no reason to fear death. Because if you think that you're going to be punished eternally in a hell type situation, then you're just going to be cowed into submission by those totally irrational threats that don't have any evidence to support them, but which you're not capable of defeating because you haven't thought through the situation and understood the rules of evidence and the rules of observation that let you come to a confident conclusion to reject those things. But peace of mind is being delivered from all this and having a constant memory of the general and most essential principles. That's beginning of 82.
So there's something interesting in Epicurean physics, and I think it's this. What we know, or what we think is true, is that there is no supernatural God intervening to, send us to hell or punish us or something like that. And we think we've grasped that death is nothing to really fear, because when you're dead, you don't experience pain or anything else. You don't experience being dead. There's this looming sort of problem in Epicurean physics, which is that not only will you die, eventually the entire world that we're on, which is one of an infinite number of worlds, the world that we're on is eventually going to meet total destruction. The atoms that compose it are eventually going to disperse. And what I think is so fascinating is that idea does not really get grappled with anywhere in the surviving texts that I've seen. And just to bring this in, I've already quoted Virgil. Let me bring in a quote from Ovid also about Lucretius. What Ovid says is, the verses of sublime Lucretius shall not perish until a single day shall consign the world to destruction. Is it interesting? And I guess I'm asking you, Cassius, and you, Martin, is it interesting that Epicurus knows or thinks he knows that a day will come that consigns this world to destruction, and yet he doesn't approach it like some frenzy? fundamentalist who's standing on a mountaintop waiting for the rapture after having sold all his possessions because he won't need them anymore. He's going to heaven. Epicurus knows that this problem is there. He knows that it's coming. He doesn't know when it's coming, but this doesn't seem to really affect any portion of his life or philosophy. And that I find interesting because
he's not scared of it. He's not frightened by it. He's not obsessed with fear of it.
Nor is he anxious to bring that condition about, as we tragically and unfortunately see in some of the revealed religions. They want the world to end. Epicurus, it's like he discovered this idea. He thinks it's true, and that just kind of sits on a shelf because we've got our lives to live. There's no real reason to have any fear in the idea. I think there's a kind of person who thinks, maybe they've come to terms with their own death and are quite happy to say that they don't think that there's anything to fear in that, but they would feel something at the loss of the world and a entire human race. And I guess I don't know how those people would react. I also don't know how significant a portion of the population that is. So maybe it's not really worth going into, but it does. That's out there, and that Epicurus doesn't really have much to say about it.
Joshua, we got to get more in on this. But Joshua, okay, as far as whether he doesn't have much to say about it and whether it sort of sits on a shelf or not, I think we're talking about our own modern perspective on some of this almost as much as we're talking about Epicurus, because there is a pretty good bit of it in Lucretius that expands on just these issues of the ultimate destruction of our world. And I guess it's in Herodotus as well to some degree. Maybe we don't have as much of the text, you're right, that really have Epicurus going off on it or not. But I would argue that this is hugely central to everything, that the knowledge that we are going to die, that the knowledge that our world itself is going to come to an end at some point. I mean, that's a huge part of our motivation to gather ye rosebuds while ye may and seize the day and so forth, is that that these opportunities are not going to be available to you indefinitely. It's almost like that's part of the anesthesia we live under in the modern world, is we're all infected. We're all taking this Christian or even humanist or spiritual perspective that, well, we don't really know what the situation is, but we think that the universe is guided by some divine providence and there's a divine fire. And when we die, we may not go to a Christian heaven, but something will happen to us. Everything will be fine. To me, I think a lot of us have that viewpoint drilled into us that our life is just a preparation for eternity, that we're going to somehow experience eternity. And I think Epicurus had totally the opposite position. But it doesn't just sit on the shelf. It is part of your real ultimate motivation to use your life as best you can while you have it. So I'm agreeing with you, obviously, in most of what you're saying, but I just think it's extremely important and extremely essential in understanding Epicurus that this knowledge doesn't send you into depression or nihilism. It should spur you to action while you have the time, to make hay while the sun shines, all the different cliches you can employ for that need to use your life productively before you get old, before you're not able to anymore. Now I'm ranting again. Martin?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of two possibilities why Epicurus wasn't concerned. One thing is the principle not concerned because he wouldn't fear death, the state of death, because he wouldn't sense it. And the other thing could be there were no imminent signs that this breaking up of Earth would happen anytime soon.
Right,
Sure.
right. So go ahead, Joshua.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. I do wonder how something like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius would have affected the Roman Epicureans. But of course, apart from what survived because of that eruption, we don't really have any record, I don't think, of what they may have thought about it. And certainly that's the kind of thing that people today would say, oh, it's the wrath of God. It's because we tolerate sin in our society, all this. No, Cassius, I think you've more or less answered the objection. And I do agree with you. That you only get one life, and it's the one you're in right now. And it's never coming again. And what you choose to do with that information is going to determine what kind of life you have. And I hope it's a good one.
Yeah, and I'll close off the rant by going back one more time to the point of some people seem to conclude that Epicurus's primary motivation in life was that of fleeing pain. But this is the kind of perspective that to me just totally reverses that and says that he was not concerned about fleeing anything because he had an understanding that there's not going to be an eternity of suffering. And just like Principal Doctrine 3 says, that if pain is really, really strong, then it's not going to last very long. If it's not so strong, then it's going to be manageable. And those are just observations about the nature of life, but they tell you that pain's something you can deal with. What you can't deal with, what you can't change, is that you're only going to have a certain length of time to live. And you'd better live while you have your time period available to you, because nothing you can do is going to provide you extra life once you're dead. The world around us at some point is going to suffer the same fate. And that's one of those things I think Seneca is the one who records that Epicurus said, to think about death. And that the Epicurean, the skeleton cup from Boscorial has that picture of Epicurus as a skeleton with the pig at his feet and facing off Zeno, the Stoic, and so forth. They were very well aware. I think that's what one thing Epicurus teaches, is to be very aware of the issues of life and death. And to me, ultimately, when I get depressed or when I get distracted or when I get irritated about something, one of the best ways to eventually pull out of those problems is to realize that you're not extending your life 1 minute by worrying about something you can't change. You'd better use the time that's available to you as best you possibly can. And there's lots of Epicurean sayings that talk about not wasting your time, but using it productively to pursue a happy life. Just like we are going to be able to finish today, what about the second part of 82 here, that we should pay attention to our internal feelings and to external sensations in general and in particular, according to whether the subject is general or particular, and to every immediate intuition in accordance with the standards of judgment. For if we pay attention to these, we shall rightly trace the causes whence arose our mental disturbances of fear. And by learning the true causes, we shall free ourselves from all that which produces the utmost fear in other men. Kind of a repetition of what's been said several times, but when you've got something really important to say, you hammer it home.
Yeah, I guess I don't have much to say in response to this one. What we're going for here is what he says in 83, which is that by the study of nature and by working out, he's going to give you the sketch of the system by sort of plugging away at it and studying nature and thinking about it, not just when you're reading a book, but sort of thinking about it throughout your day and how it affects your life and what it means for things like the supernatural and for death, that by working all that out, what you can hope to get, in Epicurus's view, is unrivaled strength, he says, compared with other men. Unrivaled strength to endure so much of what we've been talking about, this fear of death and the afterlife and the destruction of the world. And that the antidote to all that is peace of mind, and that what that comes from, as he says in 82, is having a constant memory of the general and most essential principles of his system of the study of nature.
Joshua, on that point, people who may not have read A Few Days in Athens won't necessarily get this example. But to me, when I think about this point, I think about Frances Wright came up with the example in her book of this Hadia character, this woman or girl who was just extremely attractive and had all sorts of things going for her and so forth. But she seemed to really, because of her circumstances, her beauty, her wittiness, her attractiveness, all these different things that made men or other people just kind of fall over her, she was able to live a happy life for herself without need to worry about studying philosophy and getting caught up in all of the philosophical issues that the other guys were talking about most of the time. But that's not realistic for most of us. Most of us aren't blessed with circumstances where a happy life is just dropped into our hands and provided to us by other people or by nature just because we're the cutest or the strongest or the most talented, the most witty, the most musical. We just don't have, if we want to call it luck, or we aren't blessed with those circumstances that everything is handed to us, that we can just experience happiness from moment to moment without any obstacles from the outside. Most of us have obstacles of certain kinds that we have to deal with, and it requires philosophy. Go ahead.
Will have obstacles as they go through life. It's not the case that Hedea is going to be able to do this forever.
Right. She almost gets herself drowned, even in the story, by crossing the stream in a way that was out of her control.
What it takes is what Epicurus encourages, which is you shouldn't delay to study philosophy, whether you're young or old, because this is really the most important thing. And by starting early, you give yourself a better foundation later on. Sorry to have interrupted you there, but
no, that's all right. You're exactly on the same thing. We've kind of concluded the story today by talking about the eclipses and risings and settings of the stars and so forth. And to me, there's a distinction here with atoms. We also cannot observe atoms directly, and yet we do come to some conclusions about them. But the stars and the planets and so forth are great examples of things that we have some information about that we can see, but we don't have nearly enough information that we would like to have. We, until recently, have not been able to go to some other planet and see firsthand that it's not a supernatural thing. So the stars and the eclipses are a great example that everybody's going to be confronted with situations in their lives where they don't have the information they would like in order to come to a absolutely confident conclusion through their eyes as to what they should believe, whether the planets are gods, what happens after death. Those things are just not something we can touch and feel and see up close. But in order to live happily, we have to come to some conclusions about what we think about them, whether they are going to threaten us with burning in hell for eternity, whether the stars are gods who are trying to tell us how to live and who to date and who to get married to and all the different things that the astrologists like to predict, and whether the alignment of the planets is going to be predicting victory in battle, or whether we see some line of things in the stars today and instead of being a planet, those are Elon Musk's Starlink satellites. We have to understand the things that we see and have some confidence in making sense of them. So that's what philosophy is all about and what Epicurus is pointing to, and it will give us an unrivaled strength compared to other men, or as Hicks says, it will incomparably better equip you than your fellow men to understand and deal with all these things. It will be of constant service to him if he can keep these general observations in mind and a framework for understanding these things. The last sentence in Hicks: it is of such a sort that those who are already tolerably or even perfectly well acquainted with the details can, by analysis of what they know into such elementary perceptions as these, prosecute their researches in physical science as a whole, while those, on the other hand, who are not entitled to rank as mature students can in silent fashion and as quick as thought run over those doctrines most important for their peace of mind. So no matter how far into the analysis you are, it seems to be saying that the method of prosecuting the research is going to help you, no matter how much or how little facts you yourself may know.
And in both translations of the letter, we end at the same point, which is the last three words, peace of mind.
Peace of mind, which I would make the point again, peace of mind is a pleasure. It's not just an absence of anything. Your goal is not to empty your mind of all thoughts and just float into a world of nothingness. Your goal is to live happily with pleasure.
Very good. So that's the end of the letter to Herodotus.
Right. So let's talk about that aspect for just a moment. Next week, we've been talking about proceeding with the letter to Epicurus. And so I think we're going to find many of the same observations there that we've been talking about in Herodotus. And the letter to Epicurus doesn't really get a lot of attention. Most of the attention nowadays goes to the letter to Norcus, then sometimes to the letter to Herodotus and Lucretius and so forth. But I think there are some very good general rules of thinking and rules of how to approach life in the letter to Epicurus, and we can move to that next. Let's talk about then general conclusions or general comments on the letter to Herodotus and wrap up this part of the series on the letter to Herodotus. Martin, you want to go first?
Well, I have nothing to wrap up.
All right, very good. Joshua, what are you thinking?
What I'm thinking, I guess, is of a line by Philodemus where he talks about the unforgivable negligence of Epicureans with regard to the books.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first read that line, I certainly saw myself in it. And so, because I haven't spent a whole lot of time with these letters up until now, and it's been certainly there's a lot of value in doing it, because what we have here are really the only sort of very small set of the only surviving works by Epicurus himself. And so whether you find them slightly dull, as I can imagine you might, or whether you find them rough going or slightly boring, there's value to be had, I think, in all of these letters. And hopefully we've done our job here by maybe bringing some of that value out and talking about it. I just think it's important not to do what I've been doing up until now, which is maybe skimming over a couple of these letters and then sort of ignoring them. As to this letter itself, I don't have a whole lot to say. It's that line I keep going back to, which is that his chief happiness is in the study of nature. I think every time I say that, I butcher it slightly worse each time. But
well, I think to some extent what you just said reminds me just that we have these letters because Diogenes Laertius preserved him in his summary of the lives and opinions of the eminent philosophers, I think is one of the titles I've seen his book. And of course, Diogenes Laertius was writing sometime 100, 200, 300, whatever, AD. He had all of this information available to him and the ability to summarize these opinions of everybody from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all the other philosophers, all the different people and schools that he wrote about in his compilation. And I believe I'm correct in saying that of all the philosophers in all of history that he chose to include, it's here in his last book, in his summary of Epicurus, that he gave something like this at all. I don't think that Diogenes Laertius preserves any lengthy material from Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, any of these other guys. But when he gets to Epicurus, he gives us not only the principal doctrines, but these three lengthy letters. It seems to me to be much more detail than he provides for almost any of the other philosophers. So that itself goes to show how significant these letters themselves were to him. And after all of his knowledge that he had from all these other philosophers, these he chose to preserve for us. And so must have thought they were worth reading. And so, okay, well, let's go ahead and conclude for today then on that point. We've now finished the letter to Herodotus. We'll go on to Pythocles and then eventually to Menorchius. And we invite everybody who's interested in discussing these things to come to the EpicureanFriends.com forum, and we will have a thread for this episode and each of the books, and look forward to talking with everybody there into the future. So thanks for your time today. We'll come back next week.
Good.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrew.
Bye.
Bye.